Yo, what's going on today, guys? We're back here for another video, and ranked will be coming out at reset tonight. So I'm gonna give you every single strong meta deck that you can take and get that top 1000. Not only will we be going over the deck profiles, we will also be looking at the meta game data for every single one of these decks and seeing what they beat and seeing what they lose to. So the first deck is going to be the classical Suicune. This deck has won multiple tournaments, and for the last week and a half, it has been the most represented deck in every single tournament. And unlike every other deck, it is the only deck in the game that can beat anything as long as its draw is good. It does have some bad matchups, but we have seen it overcome those in time. This is the most standard build. And yeah, I mean, some people take out the Frogadier and run something like a Copycat. Some people just take it out and then run something like a May as well. So there are a little bit of different options. You could also play the other Frogadier if you want to. And if we actually go into the metagame for this specific Suicune Greninja EX, we can see here, it beats everything. It beats Hydreigon, it beats the Altaria decks, although this one is 50%, specifically the Greninja version. It beats DarkZone. It does lose to Magnezone Oricorio, Venusaur, and Decidueye. Those, and sometimes the Blaziken decks as well. Those are the only bad matchups you have. So you have 3 bad matchups where, like, it's not even too bad because, like, this one's a 45%. The Decidueye and the Venusaur ones are kind of, but at the end of the day, in the Venusaur you can get a fast Greninja EX to be able to beat them. Same thing in the Decidueye. I've done it, and I've also had it done to be before playing those decks. So you just got to draw better if you are facing a bad matchup. And yeah, I think that's enough for Suicune. We already know, it's been meta relevant for 4 seasons now. We can go into the second variant of Suicune, which is going to be the double Greninja EX version. I think Frogadier is really good in this version specifically because you want to go into that fast Greninja EX. So if you are locked under Chingling, that is a very nice way to play around it. Some people do play the Indeedee. They usually take out one Irida. I'm just not a big fan of Indeedee, but I do think the deck is more powerful with it. And some people only play one cape over double Cyrus, so there are some customizations you can't play. You also could take out the Frogadier if you really wanted to. If you're not seeing a bunch of Chinglings and only fighting a bunch of mirror matches, you can play something like that Copycat instead. And yeah, this version is basically really good if we do go into the metagame. It has a good matchup into basically everything, 50%. It does lose like worse Oricorio in my opinion. And it says here you do lose to like Mega Altaria, which I kind of agree that like this matchup is not the best. However, you do beat like the regular versions of Altaria better. I know it doesn't show it in the results, but you do have a better matchup in the Venusaur. As you know, a Greninja EX will knock out an Ivysaur if that 100 damage guaranteed. You have a better time into stuff like Absol, Entei, Zard, etc. And even the Decidueye matchup is a little better, even if the matchups don't, represent it, because this deck, doesn't have the same amount of representation as the other builds, so there is less data. Plus, there are potentially, worse players playing the deck. So this is just, like I said, the same though, but it's like the same matchup, but some of the winning matchups are, less winning and more like a 50-50. However, some of the bad matchups are more doable, and it can potentially be better in the mirror match. Although it does say here there's a 48%, but from what I play, I mean, literally, bro, it's even. There's like 1 game difference from what we tested last season to Mega Rising. I can definitely, chime in, even if the results don't fully, replicate what I'm trying to say. And yeah, it's also basically just another form of Suicune at the end of the day. So I think it's time to move on to the actual different form of Suicune, which is going to be the Suicune Gyarados deck. So this deck has won a tournament. It has continued to actually have some pretty good placings. I know it just got like 5th place at a really big tournament recently. And you still make these top cuts, even though it doesn't have like the highest representation. So this is pretty much the most standard build in the build I see everybody playing. There's really not much difference you can do. I mean, some people like to play like a Cyrus over with a Sabrina. Like the Sabrina is going to be that tech slot in this deck, as well as some of those tool ratios. And technically the Pyukumuku, but you need basic Pokemon, for Gyarados to work. And if we move our way into the matchup spread for this deck, you can see here it actually has a favorable matchup into the Suicune Greninja. Pretty bad matchup in the Hydreigon, but it does beat stuff like Magnezone Oricorio, as well as stuff like Venusaur, because the Gyarados is going to be able to nuke them. Beats Absol, beats Entei. Has an even matchup into the Decidueye, but I think I would probably say it potentially favored if you do go second leading with the Magikarp, only because you can, do that, high Gyarados damage and knock something up before they, evolve. or before they are able to attack and do heavy damage. So yeah, it's just another version that has been doing strong in tournaments, and depending on what the day, it might be a good Suicune counter if you do want to use it for ranked. So next up, we're going to have the different versions of Hydreigon. I feel like this is like a pretty standard build of the one Chingling, the one Indeedee. With like Sabrina, Cyrus, Double Rocky Helmet, Red Card. People aren't really using Giant Cape like they were in Mega Rising. I mean, you always can take out the Rocky Helmet for Giant Capes, or even have like a 1-1 ratio if you are looking to do that. Some people do take out the Chingling and play something like the non-EX Absol, the one that Ben snipes right here. So that is another option if you are looking for a different tech. This could, be really good if depending on like the decks you're facing, like a bunch of Magnezones. Obviously, the Absol would provide more value than a Chingling. Hydreigon is one of those inconsistent / high roll decks, so the data is going to be a little bit weird when we do get into it. There are 3 versions I want to talk about. The first one is going to be this version, like the Chingling or the non-EX Absol, depending on which card you do want to play for this tech Pokemon. We also have this 2 Chingling version that just got won by Neuro in a tournament, so this is another option if you want more of a disruptive version of Mega Absol. This is like more like a Hydreigon, like Chingling cheese type of deck. I feel like, in my like personal opinion, I feel like the deck is more for going for those fast wins by locking your opponent out of Pokeballs and then having the Hydreigon sweep. And then we also have this Furfrou version that has also won a tournament and has also been doing pretty good. So it's kind of like hard to understand, what the differences of the matchups versions, because they are under the same category on Limitless, but this is pretty much the more standard dog version of Absol / Hydreigon. And the matchup spread on Limitless actually shows Hydreigon, having a lot of, under 50% matchups. So they technically have like a lot of losing, like Suicune and stuff like DarkZone as well as Altaria. However, the data is not 100% accurate because Hydreigon is a, very highly played deck, so there is a lot of representation, and also is a high roll deck. So in my personal opinions, the only real losing matchups are stuff like Suicune in the Altaria decks, and I feel like Hydreigon, unless Hydreigon Brick, should be able to beat everything else. Blaziken is also an annoying one, but it really just depends. If it is like a Chingling heavy day and your opponent is like constantly, using Chingling to prevent the Hydreigons, you don't play it. But if there is a day where Magnezone Oricorio or some Magnezone decks are popping off, you can definitely bring out the Hydreigon. Also good into Venusaur, because a turn 2 Hydreigon will knock out the Ivysaur guaranteed. So yeah, if you are looking for a fast deck that is pretty linear, has some easy plays with the fast 130 damage, this might be the deck you are looking for. Whether you are playing the other variants, obviously the dog variant that we were talking about, because the Furfrou is very good at dealing with Chingling, it might be a better version to play if you're trying to play Hydreigon, if there is a heavy Chingling like played day. So Altaria has also been doing really good in this meta still, and this is probably the most common way to play it. It's just the Psychic box of the Chinglings, the Jirachis, the Indeedees, as we see, the Altaria, the non-EX one to deal with the Oricorios, the Rocky Helmet. Some people end up playing like double Rocky Helmet and taking out one of the hand disruptions. Some people like both the red and the Mars. You could also take out like a Sabrina for Rocky Helmet if you like, but I think the Sabrina is really good. I mean, we know what Altaria has been doing, since Mega Rising. There also is a different variant that is running stuff like the Sableye with the Giovanni, a little bit of damage boost, and this version is going to obviously be better into the Oricorio, as you have 2 ways to deal with it. So if you are trying to play Altaria and having a very heavy Oricorio day at the same time, this might be the tech of the Sableye to throw in. You could also actually use a Carbink instead of the Sableye. It is another version that you could potentially handle. However, there actually is a version of Altaria that is better, but we will look at the metagame real quick just for the pure version before we get into that. And yeah, as you can see here, it does really good into stuff like Hydreigon. It is bad into Suicune and the Greninja version of Altaria. It's good into DarkZone. It is good into Venusaur. It is good into Decidueye, and it is good into stuff like Blaziken. Just your worst matchups really just being Suicune, as well as potentially Entei. It's basically even. So it's like a slight losing matchup potentially, and that's just because Charizard is really good against Altaria, because Altaria is usually the main attacker. And it is also bad into Oricorio, but I think I also might have already said that. So yeah, if there is a non-Suicune / Oricorio Magnezone heavy day, if people are pulling out the Suicune counters like Venusaur and Decidueye, I think Altaria might be the deck. And you can still definitely beat Suicune playing it, don't get me wrong. Like, I know the data shows that it has a 37% win rate, but obviously people played Altaria, you know, last season and was beating Suicunes. I've definitely lost to Altaria before playing this Suicune, because sometimes I either brick or they just kind of have everything and I might be missing like something like a cape. So yeah, Altaria is still going to be a strong deck. And now let's look at the other two variants of it. So there's also this Furfrou version that is going to see play. And yeah, it has two Furfrous, the Elekid instead of the Jirachi, just to save that energy, as well as only one Chingling. So this version is also better at dealing with Oricorio, just because Oricorio only does 20 damage to Furfrou, actually 30 I mean. So it actually has to 3-tap it. Combine that with the Rocky Helmet, the Furfrou is going to be doing a lot of damage. And besides that, it's just your classic tech option. So if you are looking for a different variant to play, specifically for Chingling, this might be the option for you. And yeah, if we go into the metagame, it is actually way better into the Greninja Mega Altaria matchup, and that's mainly because Furfrou is very good into the Chinglings. It's still good into Hydreigon. It's a little bit better than into the Oricorio if I'm not mistaken. But it basically just has the same matchup spread, but it's just better into Chingling because you have a very reliable way to deal with them, as well as having a slightly more favored matchup into the Oricorio. Last but not least, we have one of the most annoying decks in the game, in my personal opinion, which is the Mega Altaria Greninja. You know, Altaria hitting for 150 to 170 is just extremely strong, you know, for the Cyruses. And the Greninja combo, obviously, with the Chingling. And yeah, this deck is just very oppressive if they cannot brick. Like, this deck can definitely brick and get, you know, ruined by, you know, fellow Chinglings. But if we look at the matchup data, if we go right here, we can see that it actually has a much easier time into Greninja Suicune. Still losing, but it definitely isn't as bad. And it's still doing good against Hydreigon. And it's basically even against DarkZone. A slightly favored pure Altaria matchup. Kind of still bad in the Oricorio because you only have the Greninjas to deal with them. You also do lose to Greninja Absol, but you beat everything else still. So you basically just get like a slightly more favored Suicune matchup if you are playing this version. Plus you have the Greninja access to be able to cheese out games that like a regular Altaria might not have in that position. So I do think this is the best version of Altaria if you are specifically looking to play that card. And I think it's time to move on to the next set of cards to talk about. We also have Silvally Altaria, which I forgot to mention alongside the Altaria variants, because so this is like kind of like a last 3 days kind of cook. This deck has had a lot of placements. I believe it has 2 top 8s if I'm not mistaken, as well as a couple, you know, top 64s and top 16s. And yeah, I think this is going to be the best Silvally variant. It is an Altaria variant that has a good matchup in the Oricorio. And it is just hyper aggressive. You have like the Chingling that could stall you if you go second. You can set up on the Silvally and the Altaria like that, you know, go for those aggressive high damage situations. And yeah, I think it's just a cool version of Altaria. And it actually has the highest win rate currently on Limitless, with very low representation, however. Or at least it did. I know last time I looked, it actually had like a 79%. I guess people have been playing it more. But yeah, it's very good into stuff like Hydreigon. It's good into Decidueye, it's good into the other Altaria variants, and it is good into the Magnezone Oricorio, Venusaur, etc. I definitely recommend this deck because it only really loses to Suicune and the Greninja version of Altaria, but you also have the Chinglings to be able to disrupt them, as well as the aggressive extra 100 damage from Silvally going in first. So it might just be a matchup on Limitless that is like, you know, doesn't have enough matchup data, as there only is, what, 14 games played. Actually only 12. So yeah, I think this might be the best version of Mega Altaria, and I expect to see it actually a lot in ranked, at least at some point. So now we are moving on to the Magnezone section of the video. The best version is going to be the Oricorio. Yeah, because Oricorio Magnezone is just really strong, and it definitely got buffed from last season, and it was a strong deck last season, so there's no reason it should not be. Obviously, stuff like Hydreigon will be a bad matchup, but like the most classic version has like PCL, Guzma still, Clemont. Some people take out like Guzma, run something like a Sabrina, so that definitely is a tech option you can play. But basically, the standard deck looks something like this, and let's look at the metagame real quick. As you can see here, it is a slightly favored matchup into Suicune. Obviously, it loses to Hydreigon as well as DarkZone, but it has a really high win rate into all of the Altaria decks, as well as the Entei Charizard, stuff like Venusaur, as well as even the Whimsicott and Blaziken if it ever does come back into the meta. The second strongest zone deck is going to be Mega Absol Darkrai Magnezone. I think this deck is extremely strong. it has some bad matchups, and it does have some bricks if you like, lead the Darkrai, because you have no swap cards, and sometimes like you like wasting the energy to swap into that Chingling can be very detrimental. But this is like the best and most classic version. If you want to take something out for a different tech option, you can definitely try that. We've also seen some people play Tyrogues over the Chingling, or play one Chingling, one Tyrogue, so that is a option you can do. And if we actually look at the metagame for these for this deck, you can see here it does lose to Suicune and does slightly lose to Hydreigon, as well as Greninja Absol, but it's going to farm Magnezone Oricorio. And if we actually look at the metagame, you might not see that it has like too many good matchups. Ironically, like everything is like mostly even with this deck, and that's just like how this deck works, because it has Absol and Magnezone, which are like, it really depends obviously on the coin flips, but it does beat stuff like Magnezone Oricorio, as well as it does beat like Venusaur, Decidueye. And I know it kind of like, and obviously like Entei, Charizard, like I know like it looks like this deck, it doesn't have like too many good matchups because it is like barely not even, but this deck is just very well rounded, and this is definitely just a more like fun version of a zone deck if you do want to play. It is still competitive because it is still seeing these top cuts, these top 8s, although it's not winning tournaments like it was the first week of the season. It is still definitely a reliable choice if you are looking to get that nostalgia factor from playing the Darkrai Magnezone. We also have this new version of Galvantula Magnezone. This deck is definitely a lot of cheese because it has the fast Galvantula with the elemental switches, or just Galvantula going second with the Paralyze. And yeah, it's just going to be a different version of Magnezone if you are looking for something that is not boring as Oricorio. I actually think this version is a lot of fun to play personally. And if we go over to the meta share and look at the matchups, it has like a pretty bad Suicune matchup. Hydreigon is, actually not too bad for being a Magnezone variant, but it is good into the Altaria decks. So it's definitely a weaker version of Magnezone Oricorio because you don't have that Oricorio blocking off the EX Pokemon, but it is a little bit more fun to play. And even though it has some bad matchups like the other Absol decks, it's not the worst. And you always have that paralyzed cheese factor. Like for example, there's also just like not a lot of data on this deck because it is like very low representation. So this data just might not be 100% accurate. For the final version of Magnezone is going to be the Heliolisk variant. So this is the latest one that is did very good at a tournament. It is playing the one Oricorio package just to wall off the EX Pokemon, and I kind of like that. You could always take that out for something like a Sabrina, or even like maybe like a second copycat, or whatever supporter you did want to run. This version could cheese Suicune with the 140 damage by the Heliolisk if you are seeing a lot of those. And we can just go into the stats. Yeah, as you can see here, it does beat Suicune. It obviously loses to stuff like Hydreigon, and it is like kind of decent, I want to say. Actually no, it's actually pretty bad into Altaria for just from this data, but like the previous deck, there isn't a lot of data for us to actually work on with this deck because it isn't super represented. But as you can see here, at least from the Suicune, there is a decent amount of matches, so you could always use it to cheese that Suicune win. Moving on to the grass decks, we have Mega Venusaur, and I don't like Mega Venusaur. You guys know that. I don't like him in tournaments. However, I think that this deck actually has a really big place for ranked, and that's because ranked, like Stokesard always performed very bad in tournaments, but in ranked, it always popped off because it's a deck you can just play a bunch of games. There's really no thought process. So we have the solo Venusaur just with a bunch of hills, the Rocky Helmet, stuff like the Cyrus Sabrina, and this is going to be a really good deck if you are just trying to play fast games and farm stuff like the Suicune, as long as you don't brick. You also have another version of technically like a solo Venusaur deck that is playing a one Chingling line, and you have slightly less hill cards because you are using more Pokemon and Pokeballs, so you have a little less tech options. But yeah, I think if there's ever a Suicune dominated day, I think Venusaur could really have a showing. I think it's going to be actually seen a lot in ranked, just because like I said, it is that Stokesard like deck where you can just play kind of just maybe you're like sleepy, you might be on the bed and you don't want to have any thoughts before you pass out. Venusaur might be the perfect deck. And if we actually look at the metagame, we can see here that a farm Suicune, it is actually pretty decent into Decidueye as well, but it basically loses to every single other deck. So like I said, if there's a Suicune heavy day, I could definitely see Venusaur popping off and being really consistent. And I expect Suicune be a really represented ranked deck. which is why I think Mega Venusaur at the end of the day is going to be fine. You can also just get those coin flips and win. It's also good in the Hydreigon if they don't get a fast Hydreigon. Like if they take a couple turns to get that Hydreigon, you will actually be able to just sweep them. Like the Mega Absol gets one shot if you have a Rocky Helmet. You could always, you know, sleep it as well. So yeah, I mean, this deck is going to live and die by those sleeps. It farms the best deck in the game, which is going to be the most representation. So that's why that's why I think it has a place in the meta. I think another grass deck that's going to be really good because it kind of does the same thing, but it has, you know, better matchups overall to everything else because it has that bench snipe potential, is going to be the Decidueye. And this is a version of the deck that just won a tournament. There are also versions that are playing something like a Chingling as well, with like double Pokeball, and they basically are taking out some hill cards. Like you'd probably see like one less of one of these Decidueyes, a Chingling, double Pokeball. And I've been like kind of like thinking lately, like I don't even know if I want to play Quick Row. I think I almost just want to play 2 Dartrix instead personally, just to play around Chingling. I understand why the growth can be kind of nice because most of the times you want to go for the rare candy anyways. But yeah, if you're seeing a bunch of Chingling, you could always do that. Some people prefer 2 leaves. Obviously the tournament winning list just play 2 Rocky Helmets, so that's why I have one of each of these here. So, you know, there's definitely some different variants of playing the Decidueye. And yeah, looking at the matchups, you can see it farms Suicune. Slightly bad on the stuff like Hydreigon and the Altaria variants. Really bad into the other Altaria variants. But it does do good into stuff like Greninja Absol. Also the Lopunny decks. And it actually can do good against Blaziken if they don't open Blaziken because you have that bench snipe power. So that's just like something I want to mention. Even though the data is pretty low, so there's not like a big sample size. And it actually is surprisingly good in the Magnezone Oricorio. I know the data doesn't reflect it, but just from personally playing, like a fast non-EX Decidueye is going to be able to sweep this deck. Like the new Magnezone is annoying compared to the other one, so that's probably why it's kind of like more annoying. But it definitely is not like an auto loss. And you know, Decidueye, if your opponent does break like a fast like turn 2 Decidueye EX or just non-EX Decidueye, can't disrupt them. Like you could like snipe a Swablu, etc. So this deck has like a lot of factors going for it. And I think it's going to be a very solid rank deck because like Mega Venusaur, it's just going to be one of those turbo stage 2 decks, and kind of like if you just do your thing and your opponent like slightly bricks, you will be able to just like sweep the game. So this is definitely a deck that I'm going to probably be having on standby for day 1, depending on what the meta is looking like for that top 1000 race. Honorable mention to Whimsicott, because Whimsicott was very good early on into the meta. So if the meta ever changes back to what it was like at the very beginning, like this deck, as we will see, is good into the dark decks like Hydreigon, as well as the DarkZone deck. So yeah, this is kind of like the most common version. I've seen some people play 2 Sabrinas over the Giovanni. This is the most recent one that did good at the tournament. And if we go into the matchups, you can see here it does really good into Hydreigon. Obviously it loses to Suicune, but it still has that cheese factor of the area doses, you know, the Sabrinas and the Whimsicott's high damage. Good into DarkZone, pretty bad into the Altarias. So yeah, it's mainly just there if you are facing a bunch of those dark decks and want to counter them. And it is a deck that, you know, we saw do good at ranked, and it also might be, or it did good in tournaments early on. It might be a good ranked deck also because a lot of the time, like aggro decks, like you'd also play, like this deck can play matches very fast. So it might be one of those decks that kind of get revived from ranked coming back. We just have to, like, you know, wait and see. Moving on to the fire decks. So yeah, Charizard Entei has actually been doing surprisingly really good in these last couple of tournaments, in the last couple of days. And yeah, this deck kind of like struggles against stuff like Suicune. There's kind of like 2 variants people are playing. They're playing this one as well as a version that is playing stuff like Indeedee instead to have that little bit more sustainability. And if we move on to the matchups, you can see here it's not looking too good for your boy. However, it does have like that positive Lopunny matchup, has a positive Greninja Absol matchup somehow, or like not positive but even. Also farms all of the grass decks, so if you are seeing a bunch of Decidueyes and Venusaurs, this is a deck that you can't play to be able to counter them. And you know, Charizard always has that Charizard 250 factor where it definitely can't choose wins because it can knock out something like a Mega. And just because it's a fan favorite deck, I expect to see a bunch of it in ranked. And we have the last fire deck, which actually is going to be Blaziken. This is kind of the most popular version that I've been seeing people play in the last couple of days. You can definitely cut out the Chingling and the Furfrou and play like just 2 more like the classic version because we are going in the ranked. I don't like this version personally because it doesn't run a flame patch, so I kind of recommend taking this out. And if you want to play like 1 Chingling, 1 Heatmor, go ahead, but I kind of still prefer like the double Heatmor version with like, you know, a couple like one flame patch and you know a different tech spot. That's just like me personally. That's just how I prefer to play the deck. So if you are playing Blaziken, you can think of a couple different options to play alongside of the Torchic. And let's go into the matchups. And as you see here, it has a bunch of even matchups, you know, very good into the Venusaur, even with the Decidueyes. And yeah, it's just that aggro deck, you know, a fast Blaziken can sweep through your opponent. And it's pretty good in the Hydreigon, even if the data doesn't, like, I know it's only a 51%, but it was really good into Hydreigon last format. And it's pretty good into Suicune too, whether you have like a Rocky Helmet, or if you use something like a Guzmo, which you could definitely tech in the deck to be able to knock out the Suicunes at 160 HP, and then get that Sabrina win for the final KO. Yeah, I think this deck is just, you know, really good, and I expect to see a lot more of it in ranked compared to tournaments, just because like the other deck stuff like Decidueye and Venusaur, it's one of those brain off decks where you just, you know, try to spam the return to rare candy. We also have a couple of Mega Lopunny decks, so I feel like the better one right now going into the format is going to be the Silvally variant. This is like a deck that has been seen very little in tournaments in the last couple of days because it is a new cook. However, it has had some pretty good placements for those few days. And there's just not enough data on Limitless to actually look at this deck. So I'll move over to it, but like I said, bro, there's just not really enough data to really define whether a matchup is good or bad. Because like looking at it, it like loses the stuff like Suicune, Hydreigon, you know, which actually, you know, not too much of a surprise. But yeah, there's just not enough data. I mean, obviously it's going to be really good into Magnezone Oricorio because you have that Silvally and then Lopunny for the Magnezone. But you can't really, you know, look at this and state any facts. So if you are looking to play Lopunny, like I said, not the best card to use because there is a bunch of different better options. But if you're specifically looking to play that card, this is why I am talking about it and showcasing it to you. We also have the classic version of Lopunny that is going to be playing the Lucario in the Hitmontop. So this deck was really popping off at the beginning because it really destroyed stuff like DarkZone as well as the Oricorio Magnezone. So if you ever are fighting a bunch of Oricorios, this is a deck that you can go into to be able to farm them. But however, like, you know, the matchups into everything besides like Whimsicott, the Magnezone Oricorio is not going to be the best. So you might, and it's also slightly good into Venusaur because the Lopunny can, you know, do high damage. Sometimes you can just knock out the Ivysaur right away if there is a Lucario if you do go second. So yeah, this deck is just going to be able to farm Magnezone Ori if you are looking for an option, or you're specifically looking to play one of the new Megas that came out in Crimson Blaze. You can play this deck. I think there are a lot of better options, but I still wanted to talk about it in the video because it has had some good results and still gets occasional top 8s. We have Greninja Absol, which I think is a very strong deck. This is going to be my day 1 ranked deck unless I load in the ranked, and for some reason it's all a bunch of bad decks like the Decidueye and Venusaur to go into this. Yeah, this deck has a lot of options because you have the massive pings from the Rocky Helmets, the Darkrai, the Greninjas, and the Chinglings to disrupt your opponent. You have the Absol to discard the Cyruses so you don't lose end game by fellow Greninja decks. And yeah, this is just like the most classic build that I see everybody using. I've seen some people take out 1 rare candy, 2-player Frogadier as a way to play around Chingling. I just kind of like the fact of the 2 rare candies for ranked because you just, you know, want to copycat and find them if you aren't facing Chingling. So this is going to be the deck list that I am going to be running. And if we switch into the matchups, it is going to be able to be Hydreigon, DarkZone, and the Altaria variants. I know like it says it's not that good into Altaria like this one, but it is good into the Greninja Altaria, which I expect to be way more represented. And it's just really good against everything, bro. It has like a bad Decidueye matchup, but sometimes like the Chinglings can prevent them from evolving and you can win like that. Like I've done it multiple times last season. Nothing in that matchup has changed besides the quick row, which, you know, doesn't really change the matchup because Chingling still prevents them from using an item card at the end of the day. So it kind of looks bad in Limitless, not that bad overall because it is only a best of 1. And it also still is good into Suicune because the Chingling can prevent them, and then you get like Cyrus and their Froakies and stuff like that, making these Suicunes do very little damage to the Mega Absol. So there's just a lot of factors going for it that I want to say. And I think this is a very, very strong deck. And the last deck I have is going to be Jolteon. This is another fast, aggressive deck because you have both the Zeraora, you have the Jolteon EX, and even the 1 non-EX Jolteon for that quick 60 damage into the active spot. So this deck has actually, it was like really good at the beginning of the format, kind of fell off in the middle. However, these last 3 days I've been seeing a lot of Jolteons actually top cutting and doing better once again. And yeah, this is kind of like a standard version of people playing it. I feel like, you know, Jolteon always has a lot of tech spots. Like some people just play like solo Jolteon, they don't play the Oricorio for another tech spot. But I do see the value in the Oricorio because it can clutch up in matches such as Altaria to be able to stall a couple hits and, you know, actually just buy you enough time to be able to, you know, whittle them down to knock out the Mega before the Jolteon might get damaged. And yeah, this deck actually beats Suicune, loses the Hydreigon because, you know, that fast 130 damage is going to hurt. And it is good. Stuff like the Charizards as well as stuff like the Venusaurs. And it's also actually pretty decent into Decidueye. So yeah, this is a deck you could play if you are looking to play Jolteon and Evolution. And just a deck that is going to be able to be Suicune and the counter decks to Suicune as well. Anyways, I think that does it for every single deck that I would personally recommend playing in ranked. If I did miss one that you think did deserve to make on the list, let me know in the comments. I'm personally going to be playing both Absol as well as Decidueye probably on the first day, and maybe a little bit of Suicune depending on how it is going. Anyways, super excited to have ranked back. Let me know in the comments. Like I said, peace out. Have a lovely day as always.